Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
Have you ever been told, straight to your face, that you don't belong at your own family holiday because your life doesn't look like theirs? I had always known that being single and childless in a family where every conversation seemed to orbit around diapers, school plays, and mortgage rates made me stick out like a sore thumb, but I never thought they would actually say it out loud. Yet that is exactly what happened last December, when my sister, Laura, leaned across the table at my parents' house and with a half laugh, half smirk declared, "You don't have kids, you wouldn't understand." She said it as if it were a throwaway joke, the kind of line you'd toss into the air without expecting it to land, but it landed right on my chest with the weight of a cinder block, and when everyone chuckled awkwardly instead of correcting her, I realized something I had been too naive to admit before. I had officially been benched from the traditions that once meant everything to me. For as long as I can remember, holidays in our family were chaotic but sacred. I was the one who used to show up early to help mom peel potatoes and sneak bites of pie filling while pretending to taste test. I was the one who carried my nephews on my shoulders while Laura and her husband argued over whose job it was to set the table. I was the one who, when my brother Mark stumbled in late and hungover, quietly covered for him so Dad wouldn't start a lecture. I wasn't just a participant in our holidays. I was the glue that held the whole rickety circus together. But apparently, without a stroller parked in the hallway or little sticky hands tugging at my sweater, none of that counted. That night when I got home, I sat in the silence of my apartment and replayed the moment like a movie stuck on loop. Laura's smug tone, Mom's tight-lipped smile, Dad's sudden interest in refilling his glass instead of looking at me, it was all evidence that they agreed with her, even if they didn't have the guts to say it directly. I kept asking myself, when did family become a club that required children as the entry fee? Was my job not demanding enough? Was my mortgage not real enough? Was my life not legitimate unless I produced offspring to add to the family group photo? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, but anger has this way of turning into self-doubt when the people you've loved the longest are the ones who push you aside. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that I could start my own traditions and stop expecting validation from people who clearly measured love in grandkids and sippy cups. But the truth is, it mattered more than I wanted to admit. These were my people, my blood, my history wrapped up in decades of turkey dinners, tree trimming, and matching pajamas. Exclusion from that wasn't just a slight, it was like being erased from the story I had helped write. I thought back to Christmas mornings where I had stayed up until 2 a.m. wrapping gifts for their kids, just so the paper looked magical when the sun came up. I thought of the year my car broke down in a snowstorm, and I still hitchhiked half the way because missing dinner was unthinkable. And now suddenly I was an outsider, not because I failed them, but because I hadn't given them more mouths to feed. It stung. And in that sting there was also shame, the kind you don't confess to friends, because you know they'll say the predictable things like, they don't deserve you, or you're better off without them. Maybe I am, but that didn't stop me from sitting on my couch staring at the bare walls, wondering if this was my fault for never settling down, for never becoming the person they could brag about in the ways that matter to them. I even caught myself Googling fertility clinics at midnight, as if a quick appointment could buy me a ticket back into the fold. That's how deep the humiliation went. It had me second-guessing not only my choices, but my worth. When I finally closed the laptop, I poured myself a glass of wine, curled under a blanket, and thought about the irony of it all. For years, they had leaned on me, expected me to show up, fix the messes, and keep the holiday spirit alive, and now the very things that made me dependable were irrelevant because I didn't bring a child to the table. I laughed, a bitter laugh that tasted like metal, because what else do you do when your family essentially tells you you're disqualified from love? I told myself maybe next year I'd try harder, maybe I'd force myself to smile through the dismissive jokes, maybe I'd just swallow the sting and pretend it didn't matter. But even as I said those things in my head, I knew I was lying to myself. Something had broken, and there was no gluing it back together with cranberry sauce and polite small talk. I didn't cry that night, which surprised me. Instead, I sat in that stillness, listening to the hum of the heater and the occasional honk of a car outside, and I made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to beg to belong. If they thought my life wasn't enough for their table, then maybe it was time I set my own. I didn't know what that would look like, and I certainly didn't know how far I was willing to go to make a point. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let their judgment define the way I celebrated. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the ache, a spark of defiance lit up, faint but unmistakable, the kind of spark that makes you do things you never thought you had the nerve to do. And that was the moment, though I didn't fully realize it yet, that the plan for my holiday revenge started to take shape, not in words, not in lists or resolutions, but in the simple refusal to be invisible any longer. The morning after I decided I would not beg to belong, I woke up with the kind of stubborn calm that doesn't need a speech or a pep talk because it settles into your bones like a pact you sign with yourself. And while the kettle clicked toward a boil, I opened my laptop as if it were a door I had been too polite to walk through, typed in the name of a resort I had only ever admired in other people's anniversary posts, and watched the screen bloom with glossy photos of marble floors, a lobby, fireplace that seemed to melt the air around it, and a dining room hung with chandeliers that made my parents' pendant lights look like night lights in a motel hallway, then filtered for holiday availability and thought, fine, watch me write myself into my own tradition. I did the math in a practical, almost clinical way that surprised me with its cold confidence. Because it turned out that years of buying last-minute gifts for my nephews and nieces on my credit card had left me with a hoard of travel points I had never used. The kind of accidental fortune you only discover when you stop fixing everyone else's life for 5 minutes, and as I clicked through room categories, I found a suite with a balcony that wrapped like a ribbon around the building with a view over a winter coastline that in the photos looked silver and unbothered, and I realized I could pay for most of it with those points. Those tiny rewards for the countless times I had been the dependable aunt who made the magic happen while the parents took their bow. There was a whisper of guilt, yes, a little voice that said this is petty, this is performative, this is not you. But the louder truth was that I had been performing for years, only the applause had never been for me. And the difference now was that I would be the one choosing the costume and the stage. I added the spa day with the ridiculous name, the chef's table seating at the restaurant that liked to put truffles on things just because it could, and a late checkout that felt indecent in the most delicious way. Then paused at the payment screen and thought about every time they had handed me the tin of sugar cookies and said, "You can do the stockings, right?" As if that were some sacred rite I should be grateful to perform. And decided that this time the only stocking I would stuff would be the giant white robe waiting for me on a warmed hanger. The revenge, when it arrived, did not announce itself with drum rolls or a villain's cackle, because I chose something quieter and smarter that would land exactly where I needed it to land, and I opened the family holiday plan spreadsheet. The one I had built years ago so the chaos would feel organized and the mistakes could be tracked without starting World War III, and I erased my name from the column labeled stockings, deleted it from desserts, slid it out of airport pickup, and in each empty cell I typed a single sentence that was not cruel, but certainly not coy. Consult the person who said I wouldn't understand. Then I changed the sheet permissions so everyone could see the edit history highlighted in bright color with my name on it. Because sometimes the cleanest cut is the one you make with perfect handwriting. I know how that sounds, and maybe you think that is childish or smug or a little bit tacky, and you might be right, yet it felt like setting a bone that had been broken and badly healed, a sharp pressure followed by relief, and to keep myself from softening, I drafted a calendar invite titled My Holiday, No RSVP Needed, and sent it only to myself to block the dates with a quiet, private banner, then built a simple automation that would post one elegant photo to my feed on the morning of the holiday, a glass lifted near a tree taller than a house, not my parents' house of course, but I admit the thought flickered, because I wanted the reveal to unfold on my terms rather than arrive as a defensive manifesto when someone inevitably picked a fight. Before clicking Confirm Booking, I called the resort and asked the concierge, in a voice steadier than I felt, whether there was any chance of a view upgrade because I had just been cut out of a long-standing family tradition and needed something both comical and ceremonial to replace it, and the young man on the other end laughed softly and said he would do his best. Then asked whether I might like a complimentary reservation at the portrait nook they set up near the lobby tree, which sounded absurd until I pictured myself in a simple black dress, holding a quiet smile that did not ask permission from anyone. And I said yes because sometimes you say yes to the thing that seems a little over the top precisely because you have spent too long under it. When I finally pressed the button and the confirmation number flashed on the screen like a tiny brass plaque nailed to a door that had just swung open, my phone lit with a new message in the family group chat, Laura asking who was bringing the pecan pie since I usually handle that, Mom attaching a list of errands, Mark throwing in a joke about how he would supervise, and for a moment I stared at the typing bubbles with the old reflex to fix, to smooth, to save the day. Then I copied my reservation notice into a notes app instead, saved it for later, and calmly pasted the link to the spreadsheet they all ignore until it explodes, letting the edits speak for me with the clarity I never owed them, but gave anyway. The room upgrade email landed less than a minute later with the subject line "Suite confirmed," a phrase so perfectly on the nose that I nearly laughed out loud, and while I sat there feeling the braid of hurt and triumph tighten in my chest, the screen flickered again with Mom's name trying to call, then again with a second alert from the resort offering a photographer for holiday portraits and the note that many families used it to send cards, a detail that felt almost too poetic, because as I held the phone, listening to the call ring and ring, my thumb hovered over one harmless little button that would add the resort's shoot to the shared family album out of sheer habit. And I wondered whether I should tap it and let the hint land like a feather or keep it to myself until I had the kind of proof that does not ask for interpretation. And that is when the call went to voicemail and a new message from Laura appeared, terse and suspicious, demanding to know what I meant by my spreadsheet notes, just as the concierge's second email arrived with a polite question about whether Miss Turner preferred sunrise or dusk for her portraits, and I felt the decision about how loudly to announce myself gather like a storm behind my teeth as I chose a time and left the family chat unanswered. I arrived at the resort on a sky the color of pewter that threatened snow without committing to it, the kind of weather that makes a grand lobby feel like a sanctuary rather than a set piece. And as the automatic doors breathed open and a wave of cedar and cinnamon rolled over me, I understood why people treat places like this as chapels for their better selves, because the marble floor gave back my reflection as if to say, here you are, intact and undeniable, while a fire the size of my first studio apartment snapped and folded in the grate, and a pianist in the corner threaded familiar carols through long jazz lines that softened their edges, just enough to keep nostalgia from turning saccharine. And the concierge who had promised to try for the view upgrade greeted me with that precise mix of sincerity and performance that high-end hospitality wears like a perfectly tailored suit, handing me a key card with my name embossed in gold script and a description of the suite that sounded like a bedtime story for adults who have had enough of bedtime. The elevator rose with the hush of a confession, and when I stepped into the suite the first thing I noticed was the quiet, not the expensive quiet that feels like museum rules, but the generous quiet of a place that doesn't need to show off because it already knows it will be chosen again, a quiet made of thick walls, heavy drapes, and the ocean outside breathing in slow, deep pulls that seemed to sync with my own chest. And I walked the perimeter the way you do when you arrive somewhere you want to claim, past the living room with its low gray sofa and stack of art books, past the small dining table with a single white orchid, to the bedroom where a robe waited on a warmed hanger like a promise. And I let my bag fall in the doorway and stood at the balcony, where the coastline unspooled in a long silver thread and the wind lifted the smell of salt and cold pine and a memory of childhood sledding hills that used to end in cocoa and truce. I should tell you that I hesitated before I posted the first photo, because despite the bravado of my spreadsheet edits and the delicious pettiness of the sweet confirmation, there was a stubborn pocket of loyalty inside me that believed in leaving the family out of it, in letting this be about me and not about weaponizing a view. Yet the truth is that part of me wanted witnesses, not to my success exactly, but to my refusal to quietly absorb the insult and keep setting the table, so I framed the shot with care rather than malice, a single glass of champagne held near the edge of the balcony with the ocean glowing like brushed steel beneath a sky that could not decide between storm and mercy, and I wrote a caption that did not gloat yet did not apologize. Something about starting a different kind of tradition when the old one stops making room for you. Then I put the phone down and swore to myself I would not check it until the pianist reached the part of "Oh Holy Night" where the Melody lifts like a dare. The spa at 3 in the afternoon felt like stepping inside a snow globe someone had shaken and then set carefully on a mantel. With glass walls looking onto evergreens dusted with frost and attendants who spoke in the soft cadence of people who have learned that the body listens differently when the voice is a lullaby. And while I lay under warm towels with a eucalyptus cloud opening my head, I thought about all the years I had performed competence like a magic trick, hiding how much it cost me to catch every dropped ball, and I let the anger rise and then soften into something harder to name, an ache for the version of my family that would have teased Laura for her cruelty and asked me what I needed instead of what I could bring. And somewhere between the shoulder blades and the small of my back, the therapist pressed into a knot that felt like it had formed around the words you wouldn't understand, and I exhaled so long I felt a little lightheaded. Back in the suite, wrapped in the robe that made me look like a patient in a very fancy hospital for the emotionally exhausted, I finally checked my phone and found exactly what any reasonable adult could have predicted, but which still landed like a doorbell during an argument, because the post had started to ripple outward in that slow algorithmic tide. Coworkers commenting with careful cheer, college friends sending quick heart reactions, an ex who wrote, "Proud of you," which felt like an overreach, and tucked among them a message request from a woman named Andrea, whom I had not seen since our book club years ago, saying that she had done something similar after her divorce, and that sometimes the most radical act is letting people experience the absence they created, which I read twice because it felt like permission, and then the family wave came. Not in the comments where they would have to show their faces, but in the group chat that had been quiet since my spreadsheet stunt. Suddenly alive with Laura's tight-fingered paragraphs about appearances and Mom's worried tone about relatives asking where I was and Mark's attempt at a joke that landed like a thumbtack on a church pew. All of them dancing around the central truth that for the first time the holiday was happening without me doing the invisible labor that kept it from collapsing under its own sentimentality. I could have muted the chat and floated on the warm bath of validation, yet I am not a saint, and I am not a robot, and when Laura sent a private message that said, "Did you have to make a scene like this when you know the kids are watching?" I felt the old guilt prickle at my scalp, but I also remembered the times she had handed me a screaming toddler and disappeared into a hallway while I missed dinner, the times she had told me that the stockings were my thing as if she were granting me a hobby rather than shirking a chore, and I typed a reply that was neither cruel nor pleading, simply a single line reminding her that I had been told I wouldn't understand, and that perhaps this is what not understanding looks like. Then I deleted it because it felt too neat, and instead I sent a photo to the group album of the lobby tree scene from the mezzanine, a quiet cathedral of light that dwarfed the people beneath it to the size of regrets, and I wrote nothing, letting the image do the work a lecture could never accomplish. The phone rang almost immediately with Mom's name again, and while it vibrated across the coffee table toward the edge like a small animal trying to escape, an email arrived from the concierge confirming my portrait session at dusk with a note that the photographer preferred natural smiles and soft light, and I stood there barefoot on the carpet that felt like velvet and watched the call time out, because I knew that if I answered I would be talked into apologizing for their discomfort rather than their cruelty. Yet as the silence settled, I felt the next move crystallize into something dangerously satisfying, a small, elegant flourish that would not shout but would nevertheless be heard. And with a steadiness that surprised me, I opened the resort's guest services page, tapped the option to schedule a same-day card printing from the portrait session, and started composing a holiday message that would arrive in the mailboxes of my parents, my sister, and my brother in a few days. Sealed in heavy paper and stamped with a scene of me raising a glass beneath the tree they did not invite me to see, while my phone, face down now, began to vibrate again with a new call from an unfamiliar number that I knew, before I picked it up or let it go, was Laura's husband on speaker, ready to say something I would not be able to forget. The number flashing across the screen did in fact belong to Laura's husband, and although every sensible cell in my body begged me to let it roll to voicemail where it could become someone else's problem, I answered because I wanted to hear what the official family spokesperson would sound like when he tried to negotiate on behalf of a tradition that had never once asked whether I actually wanted to keep doing the heavy lifting. And after the briefest exchange of seasonal pleasantries that felt like passing a sugar packet back and forth across a diner table, he cleared his throat and, with a gentleness calibrated for optics rather than empathy, explained that my mother was upset, that the kids were confused, that the cousins were asking questions, that the neighbors might see my post and get the wrong idea, and could we take the temperature down a notch, at which point something in me that had been practicing for this moment stepped forward and answered in a voice so even I barely recognized it as mine that I was happy to reduce the temperature provided we started with the simple fact that I had been told I would not understand and had chosen to interpret the instruction literally by removing myself from the parts of the holiday that apparently required a parental ID badge. He reached for the compromise script, the one that suggests a quick swing by the house after my little getaway, so I could do the stockings like always and maybe bring those pecan pies you do. And I almost laughed because the subtext was not even attempting to hide, so instead of snarling or pleading I said that the stockings were taken care of and that the pies were also handled, which was true in a way that would only make sense a little later. And when he pressed for details I let a pause bloom just long enough to make him think I might apologize, then said I had redirected the stocking budget, the hours, and the care to a toy drive at the Children's Hospital 5 blocks from their house. That I had used the list I built over the years of every small thing the kids loved and matched it to children who had never once had their names embroidered on felt, and that the donation was made in our family name because if I was going to be erased from the living room, I might as well write us into a story that didn't require a tree to feel legitimate. He tried to tell me this would look like a stunt, and I suggested he consider how much of my holiday labor had always been a stunt to keep the peace while everyone else performed exhaustion. And when the silence on the other end thickened into the sound of Laura joining on speaker, I pictured her standing over the kitchen island with a hand on her hip while the oven beeped and the group chat pinged and my mother paced a groove into the tile, and I said, as pleasantly as I could manage without sounding like a hostage negotiator, that receipts were already in the hospital coordinator's hands, that permission forms for photographs were signed, that a small blurb would run on the hospital's social page thanking the Turner family for the stockings and pies delivered to the night shift, because yes, the pies had been rerouted too. A dozen to the pediatric wing and a dozen to the nurses who would not be taking a holiday so that other families could have one, and while I was on the subject, I mentioned a courier deposit at the bakery that the family could reclaim if they wanted to cover their own dessert, which seemed like a fair division of labor after a decade of my credit card quietly playing Santa's tired accountant. That was the moment the group chat detonated, not with insults exactly, but with the frantic handwriting of people who had finally noticed the scaffolding after the banner fell, my mother asking whether the donation could be anonymous, because people talk. My brother asking whether there would still be the stockings for our kids, though Laura typing a paragraph about betrayal that would have read like satire if I had not known how earnest she was, and beneath it all a current of panic. Because the hospital post would be a mirror and they were terrified of what it might show, so while my phone vibrated across the coffee table like a trapped moth, I opened my laptop and scheduled a same-day flower delivery to the pediatric nurses with a card that read, "For the ones who understand more than most, thank you, from the Turner family," which was my revenge in its most elegant form, a kindness that doubled as an indictment, generous enough to be unassailable and pointed enough to be unmistakable, and then I took a breath that tasted like eucalyptus and relief. Dinner at the resort chef's table could have been a gaudy performance, but it unfolded instead like a calm rebuttal to every time I had been told my life was somehow less. The servers narrating courses with the patience of librarians and the pianist downstairs letting the melody of "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas" dissolve into something almost private, and between courses I set my phone to Do Not Disturb. Not because I wanted to win by ignoring them, but because I wanted to hear my own thoughts land without a chorus of edits, and those thoughts surprised me by refusing to gloat, choosing instead to wonder whether the people who had leaned on me for so long could learn to stand without rage if I refused to be their cane. Though the curiosity was tinged with a wicked glee at the image of them rifling through drawers for tape and ribbon while a social post with our surname and a photo of donated stockings accrued polite applause from people who had no idea they were watching. The Neatest little family coup I had ever executed. I returned to the suite to find a voicemail from my mother that began in that brittle register she uses when she is technically not crying and ended with the one phrase she rarely deploys with me, "We need you," which hung in the air like a chandelier swinging after a slammed door, and I might have caved if not for the second message that arrived immediately after, a terse text from Laura that said the cousins were coming by for photos at 7, and did I think I could drop off whatever I had bought by 6, a choice of words that converted the entirety of my labor back into errands without acknowledging the point, and I felt the next move line up inside me with a snap, not cruel, not theatrical, but sharp enough to leave a mark. So I composed a single reply to the family chat attaching the hospital's thank you note and the photo of a little girl in a paper crown holding a stocking that looked suspiciously like my embroidery, then added the barest caption, "Tradition delivered," and right. As I hit send, a new notification rose to the top of the screen, a rideshare receipt forwarded from my father's email with a pickup pin matching the resort's front drive and a timestamp that suggested he had been in the car long enough to think this through. Followed by a short message that said only, "Lobby in 10, I have something to return," which stopped me cold because I did not know whether he meant my dignity, my place at the table, or the old red felt stocking with my name on it that he had kept in his basement like a relic. I found my father in the lobby standing beneath the garlanded balcony as if he had been dropped there by a crane that did not quite know where to set him down. His winter coat buttoned wrong by one slot so the collar leaned against his jaw in a way that made him look both older and strangely boyish, and in his hands he held a long, narrow box wrapped in the kind of glossy paper my mother buys in bulk every December. A red so polished it pulled the light toward it, and when he saw me he did not move to embrace me or scold me or perform the weary diplomacy that had become his seasonal role. He simply lifted the box an inch and said that he had come because some things do not belong in basements, which I understood before I admitted I did. Because the box was the right size and the right weight for the stocking my grandmother had sewn the year I was born, the one with the uneven letters and the felt holly leaves that always snagged on my sweater, the one my mother had put aside too years ago when she decided that adult stockings were clutter, the one I had pretended not to miss, because missing it seemed childish, and now here it was, relocated not by apology, but by action, which is the only apology my father has ever believed in. We sat near the fire where the heat licked at our shins and the pianist allowed the first Noel to unfurl into something barely recognizable, and my father spoke the way engineers speak when the blueprints do not match the build, carefully and with an eye on the load-bearing walls, saying that my mother had meant the tradition to adapt and not to shrink me, that my sister's line had been cruel even if she did not intend it that way, that he had watched me carry this family through more holidays than anyone wanted to remember, and that he did not come to ask me to fix anything. He came to return what had been taken, because a stocking, in his view, is not about children or status or photos, it is a ledger of who belongs. And if I did not feel that ledger had balanced fairly lately, he would not argue, but he could put one item back in the account, at least for tonight, and while he spoke he slid the box a few inches across the table and rested his hand on it as if studying a piece of fragile equipment. I told him, with a steadiness I had earned over the last 2 days, that a stocking returned is a gesture and not a repair, that a suite overlooking the ocean is not a tantrum but a boundary with a view, that the hospital donation was not a shot across anyone's bow but a recalibration of a tradition that had grown lopsided, and that I would not be walking back into a kitchen that had already decided I was less and less the people in it could say out loud what they had done and what they would do differently, which is not my father's preferred syntax because he believes shame is a poor building material, but he nodded anyway and said he could deliver the message as faithfully as he had delivered the box, then admitted that Laura had cried in a way that made him tired and that your mother, he said, still uses the word appearances as if it were a virtue rather than a tarp tossed over garbage. And he looked at me like a man who knows when a structure will not bear another floor and yet must sign off on one anyway. The portrait's appointment waited like a polite dare, and when I rose to go he asked whether he could walk me to the mezzanine because the balcony view would make my grandmother happy. which sounded like a trick until I realized he had chosen not to make it about my mother at all, and we rode up in an elevator filled with the smell of pine and perfume and the faint sound of ice settling in glasses. And at the edge of the mezzanine, a photographer adjusted her lens while a family posed in matching sweaters, every adult wearing the strained smile of people who have agreed to be cheerful on a schedule. And my father watched them for a moment and then pressed the box into my hands and told me that he had not yet decided whether my mother would be prouder if I came home or if I did not, which was the closest he would ever come to admitting that both options frightened him, and I said that I had not yet decided whether forgiveness was an act or a feeling, which made him huff out a laugh he did not entirely enjoy, and before we could say anything else the photographer asked if I was ready. I stood beneath the tree while the lights made a constellation of the ornaments and the lens clicked like a metronome for someone else's rhythm, and I did not smile so much as allow my mouth to hold the shape of a person who knows what she will not do, which turned out to be more photogenic than triumph, and when the photographer asked whether anyone would be joining me my father shook his head and said not tonight, and after the last shutter he took the box back, not to reclaim it, he said quickly, but to borrow it, because he had a thought that seemed foolish and necessary, which is his favorite category of thought, and he left with the package under his arm like a messenger from a front I no longer defended. Back in the suite, the scheduled card order pinged my inbox for final approval, and I reviewed the layout with the concentration of a surgeon, the photograph of me by the tree softened to the edges of a memory. The message simple enough to be read without defensiveness, starting a tradition that makes room for everyone, including me, and I pressed confirm knowing the envelopes would reach 3 mailboxes that have never agreed on much. And as I set the phone down the group chatlet again, this time with a photo from my father of the stocking laid across the mantel at home, my name slightly crooked as ever, the caption only the year stitched by my grandmother's careful hand and nothing else, followed by a second image 30 seconds later of the same mantel now crowded with the kids' stockings nudged to make space, and then a final note that read, "We are leaving room. Decide what to do with it," which was both an invitation and a trap and, in its way, a blueprint with an insufficient legend. I poured a drink and carried it to the balcony where the coastline breathed the same patient breath and the wind threaded cold through the robe's lapels. And beneath me the lobby windows reflected a tiny figure holding a glass, while somewhere 5 blocks from my sister's house the night shift unwrapped pies, and the pediatric unit rustled with paper crowns and sugar. And my phone vibrated 3 times on the table behind me with call after call that I did not answer, not because I had chosen exile and not because I had chosen return, but because I had chosen for once to let the silence do the speaking that my explanations always made too easy. And I stood there listening to the ocean argue with the shore like two people who cannot live together and cannot leave, until the glass fogged my hand and the last of the light bled from the sky. And I turned my phone face down on the table and left it that way so that when it finally rang again, with whatever decision sat on the other end, I would not be able to tell you whether I reached for it or whether it rang itself into the dark.